Okay, welcome back. And this week we're considering this question of what is the relationship between environmental justice and social justice. And I want to first just outline a couple of different positions that people might take with respect to this question. One, some people think that environmental justice and social justice are two distinct issues concerned with very different aims which often conflict. So environmental justice is concerned with protecting the environment and ecosystems and environmental resources, whereas social justice is concerned with addressing inequalities between human beings, in addressing racism, sexism, classism, poverty, those sorts of issues. And the problem, of course, especially when we think of social justice as connecting with poverty issues, is it might be thought that these often conflict, right? Because what's good for the environment may not be the same as what helps alleviate social injustices. And indeed, it might even conflict because, for example, in trying to address poverty, we're often trying to create economic opportunities or create food sources, and both of those things are often thought to conflict with protecting, for example, wilderness areas. And we saw some of Guha's criticism of this last week. So the worry is that these are just two different kinds of movements. They're concerned with totally different things, and indeed they may even come into conflict. Another position would be that they are distinct issues, but they need not conflict. That is, that it may be important to try to address both of these issues, even though they're concerned with different things, and that maybe we need to balance them, for example. But a third position, which you're probably less familiar with, is the idea that environmental justice and social injustice actually have common causes, and addressing one really requires addressing the other. Now, we're going to look at one particular view this week, which is ecofeminism. Now, I know that probably, first of all, you're wondering, what the heck does feminism have to do with the environment? And of course, whenever we use the F word for feminism, it often, it's not clear what people have in mind. Lots of people are nervous about that word because they tend to think of, I don't know, women who hate men and believe that women should be superior or something like that. Well, that's not what I have in mind, nor what ecofeminism is about. Feminism, in a very broad sense, is really basically just the view that sexism exists and has existed historically in many societies, and that it's wrong. Now, feminists, unfortunately or fortunately, disagree amongst themselves about how to understand sexism, the extent to which it's still a problem today, why it's problematic, what the causes of sexism are, and what the solutions are. So it's sort of problematic to think of feminism as one monolithic view. There are many different feminist views. They all disagree with each other. But the one thing that they tend to have in common is that they tend to maintain that sexism has existed, has shaped many of our social institutions and our history, and continues in many societies today, and that it's morally wrong. It's morally problematic, and so feminism is in many ways a movement to end sexism. Now, ecofeminism is one particular kind of feminist view, and it is this claim that environmental destruction and social injustice, such as racism, poverty, or sexism, have a common cause. In particular, a kind of hierarchical thinking or framework that we particularly tend to use in the West. Now, The idea here is that we tend to break down differences into these sort of value hierarchies. We tend to think that X is different than Y in some way that makes X superior, and therefore X is justified in dominating Y. So, for example, we think of male and civilized people and whites and humans, man in the sense of human, right, as being sort of superior, whereas the contrast distinction, right, female, uncivilized, non-white, and nature is thought to be inferior in some ways, right, in virtue of the differences that they possess, and therefore something to be dominated. And indeed, perhaps it's no coincidence that we do speak of things like man versus nature, when really what we have in mind when we use the word man is something like humans, right? But that is, in each of these cases, ecofeminists argue that these differences are understood as binary distinctions, all one thing or all another thing, and that one is tends to be better or more valuable than the other. Now, presumably, hopefully, not very many of us actually think like this very explicitly, but Warren and Shiva have argued that, in fact, this kind of thinking sort of, infects the way we think and see the world, that we tend to think of things to be dominated. And that this is part of the problem that leads to both sexism and environmental injustice. So in order to address environmental destruction, we must challenge value hierarchical ways of thinking, and the sorts of frameworks that employ those binary distinctions. And ecofeminism also has another interesting conclusion, which is that addressing environmental injustices really requires also addressing social injustices, that one leads to the other. And for example, capitalism is often argued to be a sort of central cause of both things like poverty, but also environmental injustice. And that addressing both environmental destruction and poverty requires really fighting against capitalism, for example. Now, what I'm hoping that we can do is get you a little bit more familiar with this. So there's going to also be, the next video is of a lecture that Vandana Shiva gives, one of the authors for this week, talking about ecofeminism and the connection between poverty and environmental destruction. And then I'm going to give you a case study to think about, and to think about whether or not these two issues really are interconnected.